Ladies and gentlemen, it is April 28th, 2024, and we are here to talk about the world. That means current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
Hey, how are you?
Doing pretty well, how are you?
Can't complain.
Good. Well, if you want to complain, you can. You shouldn't have to bottle up all of your difficulties and struggles. I know that that's one of the things that men are conditioned to do, is to quietly carry your burdens and not show weakness. Our football coaches would yell at us about that very much. Just because you're tired doesn't mean you can lean over and you can't do that. You have to stand up straight. You can put your hands on your hips or behind your head, but you don't lean over. That shows weakness. So a lot of people live life that way and never show it. But we appreciate you being here. We just got off the back of a skepticism conversation, which I'm sure Kukio would have loved because he was an incredibly inquisitive person who just wanted to get to the bottom of everything. And a lot of times people don't assess things enough because we have a bias of credulity. We tend to trust people because it is evolutionarily adaptive to do so. If I say, Agent Smith, there is a grizzly bear just up the alleyway, we need to lock the doors and stay safe and get any kind of thing we can to defend ourselves. If you didn't believe me and you're like, I don't know about that, instantly dead to a grizzly bear. Like, we need to trust each other in a lot of situations, so it makes sense for us to naturally do so. But the problem is that can be used against us when they try to sell us silly products like gamer beverages that are supposed to make you play Counter-Strike better. It's not going to work. You need to protect yourself from these basically useless purchases you can make. Homeopathy, for example, another one that I would consider to be definitely a scam. That's not going to help you medically at all, aside from hydration. So just get water, it's free.
Oh man, I know people who swear by that stuff.
Yeah, zero effectiveness. But people are dehydrated, so oftentimes they'll get into this and they'll be like, wow, I feel better. And it's like, yeah, you had water, silly goose. So be safe, be skeptical. Also update your existing beliefs as well, because sometimes you'll hold on to a notion that is technically incorrect, and you'll never really test it because you're just comfy with the idea. But if you actually applied your current level of criticism to it, maybe you'd realize it's not as sturdy as you thought. So lots of different elements to that.
Yeah, correcting is necessary, even when it's embarrassing.
Yep. A lot of people don't want to change their beliefs because it involves admitting you were wrong, which they can take as that means I'm less intelligent as a person, which it actually doesn't. It means you're more intelligent and more flexible with your intelligence, that you can update your beliefs and change your stance if your stance was wrong. That's big. So I feel like the word that I would recommend for people to kind of go to whenever they're proven wrong is you're being refreshed with better information. It's not an assessment of you as a bad person or as a dumb person. It's that you have been refreshed with better information, and using your same intuitive skills, you realized the bad information and updated it, which is a really big thing. That involves humility and just prioritizing truth over your ego. And it also makes you a much more agreeable person as an amazing side bonus. It's very annoying when people are stubbornly asserting their beliefs over and over again, but they're not actually admitting whenever they're standing on the faulty ground. Common tactics include repeating oneself or raising one's speaking volume. Another one is argument from authority. We talked about that today, where people will talk about the degree they have. Therefore, I'm correct because I have this nice degree.
I've single-handedly disproved that myself on a couple occasions.
Yep. If only my degree caused this to make me correct. Well, another side project that I've been doing is tracking the toxicity in Dota 2.
Oh, yeah, you mentioned that last time.
Yeah, I have, let's see how many matches of data now. I have 38 matches of data.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Of the 38 games, I'll pose the question to you. How many games do you think were clean of any kind of toxicity or rudeness?
None.
None. It's actually 5.
5.
Yeah.
5 out of 38. Okay.
Yeah. So it's rare to have a clean game, but it can happen.
It can happen.
Yes. So it's been an interesting journey in, instead of just like going by my gut of like, is it too toxic? How toxic is it? Just writing it down as it happens. And it makes the games actually feel a lot less tilting, because I feel like, okay, this person may be calling me trash and telling me that I should never play this video game again, but it's really good data for my spreadsheet. So I'm getting good stuff here. Keep it going. I actually listened to a gentleman, actually he's not a gentleman, he was very rude, an individual who is yelling in Spanish in a super animated way for 57 minutes. He was nonstop, like, mierda, mierda, caca, caca, like just yelling swear words in Spanish. Basura, basura means shit or trash. He's just yelling this constantly, and it was so funny. And we definitely got to write lots of good information about this person. But people really do spew the worst of themselves on other people in this game. And it makes it hard to grow the community, because I've had lots of nice viewers who watch me play Dota and they're like, that game has really epic moments. It seems really rewarding. And then they'll go play the game for themselves, and some random internet person tells them, do us all a favor and uninstall the game. And that makes them feel really icky. And they've really kind of made that person's day worse by saying that. And that person chose to type that. And it can even come from a teammate, which makes it feel even worse, because like, aren't they supposed to be on my team? So it's a pretty big problem, and I'm kind of surprised that no one's really tried to champion the issue of adjusting it, because it's a beautifully crafted game that is being stewarded in a very barbarous way by its community. And these are people who are, many of them, our age. They're like late 30s at this point, saying like salty pirate shit. They would never say this shit to people's faces, though. That's the thing. And a lot of the people who do this kind of stuff are keyboard warriors only. They're not actually like shit talkers IRL necessarily.
Yeah. Well, that's the magic of anonymity.
Yep.
Give a man a mask and he'll show you his true face.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's been an interesting project. I'm gonna do a Dota 2 subreddit post with the spreadsheet and kind of pose the question to the community of, do you guys like this? Because there are probably some people who do like the banter. They like the mental challenge of, if we both say the meanest possible stuff to each other, who's gonna fold first? Some people might be into that challenge. I could see that. And I kind of feel the same thing where, okay, if someone wanted to challenge me to that, I could attempt it. Like, it's a silly contest to have, but there is hateful stuff that occurs in life, so you can consider it practice for dealing with that. But that's the thing, is people aren't really signing up for that as the main attraction. Most of them, I would say. We need more data, I think. For me to make speculations about the community is one thing, but then to get the hard numbers here of 5 clean games of 38, that's better. But there are a lot of good actors out there as well. So in one sense, it does kind of inspire you of, okay, well, it's probably more players than not are actually pretty quiet and they don't really say that much. But in every Dota match, you usually have 1 to 2 people who are being ridiculous and very rude. And everyone is held hostage to that for 35 to 65 minutes.
Yeah, that's not ideal.
No. But we'll see what can come of it. I did get some questions as we were getting started, some of them sillier than others.
Okay.
People wanted to ask if Israel was purposely targeting journalists and aid trucks. I've responded with, well, it would make sense for Hamas to accuse them of that, but I don't know one way or the other. I didn't see anything about it.
I mean, I can't say definitively that the answer is no, but given what I know about Israeli combat operations thus far, at this point, I'm inclined to say the answer is no, that they are not systematically targeting journalists and aid trucks. There's an article that I started reading, and then I had to do something else. I haven't finished it yet, but they did make the point that Israel has, in this conflict, significantly loosened its rules of engagement, which is something that I assumed that they were going to do when the conflict started, but it wasn't ever something I could really prove. So I was hoping to read through the article and use that as evidence, but haven't read it yet. But in the bit that I did read, they did illustrate that there is evidence that they've done that. That it used to be that that is to say, that if the Israeli military wanted to strike a target, like a terrorist or somebody like that, generally they would have to be more senior within their organization. And the acceptable trade-off in terms of collateral damage was something like maybe 20 civilians, something like that. 10 to 20 civilians was like the acceptable collateral damage for getting a relatively senior member of a terrorist organization of one kind or another. So what they did in October is they loosened that up. So instead of just targeting senior members of Hamas, they're targeting everybody. Like, it doesn't matter how low a level you are in Hamas, you are a viable target. And the acceptable collateral damage is much higher. So instead of being like 20, now it's more like 100. So if they have to kill, if 100 civilians are in danger of dying because of an airstrike or whatever other means that they have at their disposal, to kill that target, that's acceptable. They'll do that and have been doing that. So that is my explanation for why there's been so many civilian casualties. Again, I can't prove that definitively. I don't have like all the data and whatnot, but loosening rules of engagement makes a lot of sense as the main explanation. Like, the United States has done that in the war on terror at various times. We had relatively loose rules of engagement when we were doing the drone assassination program in Afghanistan, up until the Obama administration or so, or at least a couple years into the Obama administration, and then they tightened the rules up and suddenly way less civilian casualties. So it tracks. That's the explanation that makes the most sense to me, rather than the IDF systematically targeting civilians or journalists or aid trucks or what have you. And it's true that lots of journalists and aid trucks have been hit, but I suspect that has more to do, again, with the loosening rules of engagement. Like, if you don't really, basically de facto, they don't really care where the targets are. And given just how small a space it is, it's inevitable that sooner or later they're going to hit, as collateral damage, journalists, aid trucks, whatever.
Yeah, so to me it sounds like they're just being less discriminate about what they're shooting at.
Yeah.
So that's going to happen more often. That makes sense.
Yeah, and I would point out, too, that you may intuitively think that the fact that they're willing to accept higher collateral damage is the more important change. And, there's certainly a lot to that, but I would argue that the more important change is that they're targeting the entire organization's membership rather than just the senior members. Because even if you loosen up the collateral damage restrictions, if you're only targeting senior membership, you're not hitting that many people, because there's not that many senior members of Hamas, or really any organization. But the total membership of the organization is like, what, 10,000, tens of thousands? It's a lot. So you've gone from hitting maybe a couple of targets if you're trying to wipe out the senior leadership to, by targeting everyone, tens of thousands of strikes. So even if they had not loosened up the collateral damage restrictions, just the fact that they're targeting everybody in the organization now meant that it was inevitable that there was going to be a lot of collateral damage anyway.
Interesting. I didn't know that. That makes sense, though. You're raising the number of potential targets by orders of magnitude with this change.
Yeah, I also read that they're using an artificial intelligence program called Lavender in order to do some of their target selection. Apparently, they'd always had AI to kind of help with that. I would point out that when I say target selection, it's not like they've got, an eye in the sky that's just observing everything and is picking out targets. It's more mundane than that. Basically, it's just collating intelligence on the population of Gaza using whatever information that Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency, has, along with whatever reconnaissance that the army and other branches of the Israeli military gather, and just gathering it all together, putting it into a machine, and then running it. And what they're running is basically a calculation for the likelihood that individual people are members of Hamas. And so, the probability scales up or down based off of whatever information is available. And previously, they never allowed that program to select targets that would go on to be hit. Rather, they would use the program to recommend targets, and then those targets would be vetted by actual people. And again, they were much more selective before the conflict started in October. And so the process was elongated and very, very discriminate, so to speak. Since the conflict has started, though, that process also has been expedited. So, now they're much more likely to just take whatever targets the program says are likely members of Hamas and just moving on to engaging those targets. There's very little vetting, sometimes no vetting, happening in that regard.
So, just to interject real quick, this is the plot to an anime. Psychopaths. There basically is a algorithm system that they create by linking together the brains of different criminals that kind of automatically assesses people's crime potential, and justice is meted out that way based on that assessment, and there isn't really oversight, and that ends up being a problem. So yeah, Psychopaths, really good anime. I think I've watched it twice, so it's good enough to rewatch once.
Yeah, it's pretty similar. At this point, they don't just hit people that are people they know for sure are members of Hamas. It's enough for a computer program to decide that it's very likely that you are a member of Hamas. And in that case, whether you are or are not, you're going to be killed.
Mm-hmm.
Probably very quickly and unexpectedly, given that they are leaning on airstrikes. So yeah, it's not a particularly robust system. I'm sure it's more robust than its critics would allege, but yeah, there's not a lot of accountability or people in the loop, so to speak. Well, I should say humans in the loop. They've leaned more and more on automation since the conflict started last October. And so I don't doubt that there's been more than a few errors that have resulted. Mm-hmm. And that likely also has contributed to this high civilian death toll. So no, I don't think Israel is systematically targeting journalists and aid trucks. I just think that's the natural and inevitable result of the loosening of rules of engagement that happened starting in October.
Makes sense. I had another question for you. Did you hear about any university protests?
Yeah. Have you seen those?
No. Why is it funny? I don't know what it's about.
There's been a bunch, actually. I kind of shortchanged it at first because it was only in Columbia University. They had a big protest, and then it evolved into an encampment. It was kind of like Occupy back in the day. You remember that?
Yeah.
Where people were occupying public spaces. So students in Columbia did that in some public spaces in the university. And they were saying they weren't going to leave until the university met various demands. I think the main one is that they wanted the university to cut ties to Israel, since universities engage in a lot of research and development that often involves public-private partnerships. Mm-hmm. So they wanted the university to divest itself of those kinds of investments and partnerships involving Israel. And they also wanted the university to condemn the war, symbolic stuff like that as well. But, the divestment thing is like the one substantive request. So that protest was happening, and then the university asked them to leave, which they did not do, unsurprisingly. And so then the university kind of had to make a judgment call. And ultimately, they decided to call in the police to disperse the protesters. And that went about as well as you would expect. I don't think there's ever been a period of American history where angry protesting American students have encountered an attempt by the police to disperse them that resulted in just peace and comity. It's pretty much always been a violent encounter that resulted. And so this was no different. Physical force had to be used to move people. And people were very angry about it. Reddit in particular was incensed, as it often is. And there were a lot of accusations made about, the police and, them using disproportionate force, them not having a legal reason to remove the protesters. Some of that has been justified after the fact. But regardless, the university technically, I think, was in its right to ask the protesters to leave and then to remove them when they refused to do so. So I think technically that was legal. But regardless, the legality of it wasn't really in question. It's just resulted in a lot of accusations that freedom of speech is being curbed, and the university just doesn't like the protesters' politics, and that this whole thing is just an attempt to suppress what is supposedly an unpopular opinion. Even though it's an opinion you can hear virtually everywhere, media, MSNBC, the internet, at this point, protesting in public is not really the best and fastest way to get a message out. So even if they were suppressing public protest, it wouldn't really mean much in terms of the ability of the message to spread. But that's neither here nor there. The point is that's what the protesters thought. And so they were very upset about it. And more to the point, students in the rest of the United States were also upset about it to the point where they started protesting. So the protests starting at Columbia have now proliferated at other universities in the country, including at the University of Texas. And that in particular got attention because, of course, the governor here in Texas, Greg Abbott, came out, last year or a couple of years ago, back when people were still talking about attempts at universities to shut down speech, to cancel people, generally of a more right-leaning bent. And the governor came out and said that he was for free speech and that he was not going to allow people to undermine free speech at Texas universities. So protests started at University of Texas, and he's saying that this is anti-Semitism and we're not going to allow it. And he, all but demanded the university call in the police to disperse the protesters. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of accusations about hypocrisy running around on Texas social media correspondingly. So, the same thing that happened at Columbia happened at UT. The police ran in, dispersed the protesters were angry, and now everybody is yelling.
Makes sense.
Not to much effect. None of it has actually changed anything, and I don't think it likely will. The protests, kind of like in protests for the past 10, 20 years, are not particularly well organized or directed. I think focusing on divestment is probably a good sign, in so much it means that they're actually focusing on something tangible for once. So that is to their credit. But if previous experiences are any indication, they're going to take their eye off the ball and start doing other stuff. So it's not likely to last much longer, I would expect. I said the same thing about the war in Gaza back when it started in October, so maybe that doesn't mean anything. But just given how these protests have panned out before, I'm guessing there's maybe another couple weeks or months to this. And then it kind of peters out and the media starts focusing on something else. I would point out, too, that universities are about to close because it's the end of the spring semester, thereabouts, if I'm not mistaken. Been at a college for a while, so I've kind of forgotten when exactly the semesters end. But, it's getting close to summer break. And when that happens, there probably won't be very many students on campus to protest in the first place. So I would expect at that point that it'll probably die out, if nothing else. Of course, that also means that there's going to be a bunch of students on summer break who will be able to protest elsewhere. That could happen. But I don't know how far they'll be able to take that, or even if they are able to organize that, how much impact it will actually have. So people are very excited, but they're having difficulty leveraging that into some kind of actionable change, which has kind of been the bogeyman of protest for a while now in the United States.
Yeah, same thing as what I noticed about Occupy back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
It was like there were a lot of people with a lot of passion, but it wasn't boiled down into like a few key things that we needed to all agree to change. It was like anyone who was having issues at that time kind of came out and gave their pitch. And it was like, okay, well, what's the broader issue that we're all here for? And it was like, we're the 99%. And it's like, okay, you've articulated our socioeconomic status. Now what? What are we changing? And there wasn't really anything that was obviously shared between everyone. So, yeah.
Yeah. So similar dynamic here, basically. Yeah, it doesn't help that it's a presidential election year. So that always has, that always adds a couple notches to the heat index in American politics, so to speak. Yeah, Joe Biden is kind of, as we've talked before about this, but Joe Biden is a unity candidate. He's meant to be the leader that brings together a very disparate coalition of different actors, including people on the far left and the center left, which themselves are, pretty broad groups. And so that very much limits his freedom of action in terms of Israel-Palestine. He can put some pressure on Israel, but the more pressure he puts on Israel, the more he alienates the center of American politics, and in turn, the more votes he loses to Trump. And make no mistake, the presidential election is very much going to be a battle over the center, because the far left is not voting for Trump, and the far right is definitely voting for Trump. So it really comes down to who can get that center to vote for them, or at least get more of the center to vote for them. And so, Trump is just going all in on his right-wing strategy and is hoping that he can just paint Biden in a bad enough light that he can pull enough votes from the center to make it through and win the election. But for Joe Biden, he has a more difficult task. He is actually trying to manage a broad-based anti-Trump coalition, and it's unwieldy, as a lot of unnatural coalitions frequently are. And that is definitely an unnatural coalition, if ever there was one. The one that Biden is trying to ride to the presidency. So, you may not like how he's handling Israel-Palestine, but this is about as good as it's going to get. Whether you're for Israel or for Palestine, Joe Biden is not going to be the savior for whatever end of that conflict that you support. He just can't. He just does not have the room to maneuver there. And that just makes things worse, because it makes the protesters feel like they're not being listened to or heard, and so they go even harder and louder. A lot of people, I've seen people online complain about it and say that, Joe Biden is supporting genocide in Gaza, and so what's the point in even voting for him? And of course, the inevitable response is that, well, what do you think Trump is going to do? Yeah, so, pick your poison. If you are just thoroughly pro-Palestinian in the United States, your options are very limited. You basically cannot win on a pro-Palestinian ticket. You're going to have to win some votes that are pro-Israel, and that invariably means watering down any kind of campaign platform that would be solidly pro-Palestinian. So you're never going to be happy in the United States if that is your perspective, that Palestine is right and that the United States needs to support them instead of Israel. It's not going to happen, at least not in the short to medium term. Long term, things can change. Structural changes can play out and kind of shift the calculus there. But at the moment, not happening. You could say that about a lot of things that the progressive left in particular cares about. That is a group that is large unto itself, but not large enough to win power. But because its core is so, I don't want to say rabid, but sometimes they can be very sure of themselves to the point that it alienates other would-be allies in the center. And that just pushes people into the right, which is why conservatism in the United States has generally been the default. Generally the right wing of American politics has been the mainstay, has been the mean, so to speak, in American politics for a couple of generations now. So, the progressive left has been growing in power over time, and they've definitely notched some victories. But they're not an especially popular group in the United States, and that's been much to their disadvantage. I mean, we've talked before about it, but just the political left in the United States in general does not have as natural a coalition of groups as the right wing of American politics. The Republican Party has libertarians, national security hawks, social conservatives, religious conservatives. Those groups have a lot of overlap between them, even if they have some key differences. And so it's much easier for them to go hard without losing votes. The left wing, in contrast, is like minority groups, workers, kind of, students, urban upper middle class. Like, these are not groups that have nearly as much overlap. And so creating a political identity and campaign platform that appeals to all of them in a way that appeals to all of them is very difficult. Like, it's quite challenging. So, don't be too mad at Joe Biden. He's trying his best.
Dark Brandon.
Dark Brandon.
I was joking with Chad the other day when you just look at, it's a Trump v. Biden matchup again, and it just makes you feel kind of like, I don't know, impatient / disappointed. And I just tell people that in the U.S., we let the two oldest people go for president because really this is what we have. It kind of makes sense. Like, they each represent, as you were saying last week, the establishment and anti-establishment. And that's the vibe that they're bringing to the table, but neither candidate would people really consider to be an excellent person, who is a charismatic leader, who is very fit for office. I think presidents who are running for office, before they do the presidential debate, as a prelude, they need to do a Japanese TV show style obstacle course. I think it would really refresh a lot of what we're looking for in a presidential candidate and just show you what people are made of.
It would certainly filter out the 70-year-olds. I don't think they would survive that. Kind of a de facto age cap.
Mm-hmm. I know it's a weird idea, but we could still get a Teddy Roosevelt with that.
That could be where we're going. Even without the Japanese, game show stuff. Like, ignoring that for a moment, like, in general, we could be heading towards like a return of the progressive. I think we talked about this before, didn't we? A return to the progressive coalition of the early 20th century. Mm-hmm. We could be heading towards that. Because Trump is very populist, and he's kind of moved away from certain keystones in the conservative campaign platform, things like free trade and whatnot, and embraced more government action, a more proactive government, which is not something Republicans had really done as much before. And of course, there's the rise of the progressive left and the Democratic Party. So, there is the possibility of a coalition between the progressive left and Trumpian populists, in so much as they have overlap in terms of things that they want. And that would be a very powerful coalition. But at this point, it just seems impossible because that's, the bridge between them is very wide, to put it mildly, at this juncture. They have very different visions on some key important issues. But if somehow they ever looked past those issues, it would be a very powerful alliance that would be able to implement significant reforms that would involve much bigger government on a number of issues. So that is a possible outcome to this era we're in. It's such a dramatic era. We're mostly focused on the present. We don't think too much about the future, not least because it's almost impossible to predict. Everything is uncertain right now, to the point where predictions are almost pointless. But in so much as there is a point to making predictions and forecasts, one possible outcome is that, a kind of populist coalition that sees a de facto return to something resembling the New Deal coalition, which had a very similar genesis. So don't lose all hope. It could be that all this is for the good in the long run.
Yeah, well, I was telling Chat yesterday that even though we may have a kind of ugly matchup right now in terms of two candidates that many people are not excited about at all, it is still, I would say, both candidates, either because Biden is super old or because Trump is kind of wily and not very professional. Basically, we're looking at the people around those individuals who are making a lot of the decisions and doing a lot of the actual stuff in those administrations. So we can put our faith in the other people who actually handle stuff whenever the loopy old men are kind of not really able to do their stuff. So I feel like in that sense they're both a little bit past their prime, but they're still way ahead of the next round of political influence in the country. Like, I guess it kind of raises the question of, okay, so we have this matchup, regardless of who wins, who's the response to this that's coming after? Are we going to want younger candidates as a result of this, or is it just going to be kind of the next closest thing to those two?
Well, I don't know about that, but I can point to a change that's already been made and that could continue, which is that the politics, that is to say the center of American politics, has already shifted dramatically over the past 10 years. You know, there was a kind of stagnation, maybe a logjam in American politics for a long time before 2016. You know, there were policy issues like China or like immigration that people knew were problems, but that nobody was really doing anything about because it didn't really benefit anybody to really substantively address them. And so, you know, things just kind of clipped along. It was kind of history on rails. You know, everybody talked and argued about stuff, but nothing ever really happened. And then Trump was elected, and, you know, for better or worse, there actually was substantive change for the most part. Certainly in terms of what we would consider viable political positions and topics, there's much more range than there used to be. And there is much more substantive action on things. You know, more has been done about immigration over the past 10 years than has been done over, you know, maybe the past 20, 30, probably since the big amnesty in the 80s. And that's not to say, you know, that's not an endorsement per se. You know, I would argue that a lot of things about the Trump administration were not really that substantive. You know, as much as he crowed about making dramatic changes, he didn't actually deliver on very many. But the fact he was trying at all was substantive, and it did mark a change in the emphasis and focus of an administration. And the Biden administration reflects that. You know, the Biden administration, if it were perfectly reflecting the will of most left-wing voters in the United States, would not be going that hard on, say, immigration or China. You know, certainly things like tariffs. You know, in general, Democrats were kind of more in favor of loosening immigration and going a little more back to free trade. But the Biden administration basically doubled down on what the Trump administration had done, which was cracking down more on immigration and cracking down on China and moving away from free trade. So, you know, those trends have continued. So insomuch as that's the case, it could represent a significant shift in the center of American politics towards populism, let's say. I can't even really say it's left or right since there's overlap between them. So that shift does mark a significant change in American politics that will probably be noted by future historians. You know, it could be that 10, 20 years from now, none of this is controversial and it's just, you know, common sense. But right now, there's so much debate and so much anger between left and right in the United States. People have kind of overlooked just how dramatically politics has changed, even just day to day over the past 10 years. And so what I'm saying is that that change could continue even if things normalize. You know, even if the left and the right and, you know, the populist moment kind of passes this stage of, you know, sort of rage and indignation and returns to something resembling normal, these underlying structural shifts to politics will probably persist and will likely define the next generation of American politics. So populism is here to stay, short version.
It makes sense. Well, there was a few people asking about the TikTok ban and if that's actually going to happen.
Probably. I think it was signed into law. But it's also probably going to be tied down in the courts for a while. And by a while, I mean probably a couple of years. So we're probably not going to get like finality to that thread line, that plot line for some time. So I wouldn't hold my breath. And somebody in chat pointed out, and I'd forgotten this, that TikTok itself, well, no, it was TikTok. TikTok, the company, specifically the parent company in China, said that it would not sell its American branch. And the reason is that they don't want to sell their algorithm, which is like the most valuable thing. That's like the core centerpiece to the business. So if they tried to sell the company without selling the algorithm, they're not making any money off that. That's pretty pointless. So they did say that they won't be selling, which suggests then that they would rather pull out of the market rather than divest, which would be a pretty dramatic move since it is a pretty big market. And I imagine that there are ways to get around restrictions, like even if they have to divest, I would wonder about things like setting up a shell corporation and then just running it sort of vicariously through that. But I don't know. Maybe the legislation in question covers that possibility. I don't know. But, there's always ways for rich people to get around the law. I don't doubt it would be any different for TikTok. So I imagine they're looking at that possibility, if nothing else. But for the moment, they're largely pursuing a legal strategy of challenging the legality and constitutionality of the law that was passed that's going to force them to divest. So we'll have to wait and see how all that pans out. It's all up in the air. So the real answer to the question is, I don't know, which is not a very satisfying answer, but I think that's probably the consensus answer for most observers at this point. If not, let me know. I'm always interested in feedback from people smarter than me, or even people not. Feedback in general is welcome.
Chat says that they should, like a modern American business, declare bankruptcy and then change their name to TalkTick.
There you go.
A bulletproof solution.
Well, in the spirit of the answer to that question, I'll throw out the usual disclaimer here before I forget. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I have more of a background in economics and international relations. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged. I don't read chat while we do this, but I do go back after we're done and read through it, try to get all the feedback. So it is much appreciated. I always learn a lot. Or even if I don't, I'm at the very least very entertained.
Shout out to the wall of text comments. Appreciate you. Appreciate you. People in the chat were talking about a drinking game whenever we do world discussion. Every time you say the United States, take a drink, and I told people don't do that. Don't do that. You'll get fucked up.
Yeah, I do kind of lean on the more formal title, I guess. I guess I could say the U.S.
Yeah, but it would be written as the United States if you're kind of reading text about the country.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be abbreviated that much. It's not a super long name.
I have a dumb anecdote about that. I don't know why I thought of it. So we call ourselves Americans, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the people who live in other countries in the Americas also call themselves American.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually a little bit perturbing for them that we call ourselves Americans. Because that kind of suggests that we're monopolizing the name of an entire region just for our own nationality. But then the question is begged, if not Americans, then what do we call ourselves? We don't really have Americans.
Americans. Say it with an accent.
There you go. Maybe that's the solution. I guess you could say something like Yankees, but I mean, maybe this will surprise people not from the United States, but not everybody in the United States considers themselves a Yankee, because that actually is more of a region-specific term in the United States.
Yeah, it's like Northeastern.
Yeah, that's more specifically something you would call somebody from the Northeastern United States. Certainly not somebody from the South. Calling somebody a Yankee can almost be an insult in some parts of the South. So it's a little residual from the Civil War. And this may also be of interest to those of you not from the United States, but yes, there are still people in the United States who are mad about the Civil War. That can still start an argument, even today.
Long ago as that may have been.
Yeah. So Yankee is not really the best choice. So if not Yankee, then what else? Like we don't really have a lot. So this question actually came up when the United States was first formed. There was actually a discussion in the late 1700s by the elites that founded the United States about what people of the United States should be called. Like, what shall we refer to ourselves as? And basically, there's two answers. You already know one, American, which is what we went with. But the other answer was suggested by a guy at the Continental Congress who suggested that we call ourselves Freedonians. And, free, right? It's a free country. Freedom is kind of our thing. It kind of makes some sense, but it doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, does it? Yeah. So everybody kind of agreed that sounded dumb, that we were not going to use that. And so Americans became the default. So then you may wonder, well, why Americans? Like, why was that the default? And the answer there is actually culture specific. We had already been calling ourselves Americans even when we were the colonies, because in discourse with people from the metropole, that is to say, people from Britain, we were Americans, right? People from the metropole were continentals or Europeans or what have you, and then people in the United States were American settlers, hence Americans. And, we didn't have a lot of discourse with, like, Spain and whatnot. And so it made some sense, right? It was basically just a term that was used in conversation within the Anglophone world. And within the Anglophone world, like, there wasn't really any other colonies other than the American colonies. So it made sense to just go with Americans. The fact that conflicted then with all of the other Spanish-speaking colonies and Portuguese-speaking colonies wasn't really considered a problem. Like, nobody really cared. So, that colonial lexicon, right? That colonial terminology referring to ourselves as the American colonists, that was just carried over past independence. So instead of American colonials, we just became American citizens.
Interesting. Freedonians. My fellow Freedonians. Yeah, it doesn't really... Sounds like Fritos, the snack. We really gave in to the corporations there.
There you go.
My fellow Frito-Lay enjoyers. There was another question here. Is Alaska still part of America?
Yes.
Okay. Another
question. Easy layup. 3 points.
Easy layup questions. Okay, good. Is Bigfoot real? Next question.
No idea.
Okay.
That's a Joe Rogan question.
Okay. Do you feel that Russia could pose a threat in World War III?
I mean, yes, they have nuclear weapons. Like, if there is a third world war and they were participants, then very clearly they could destroy, technically they could destroy the planet, right? A couple thousand nuclear weapons. Yeah, you could pretty well fuck up the entire planet with that. So yes, just the answer intuitively would be yes. If you're asking, like, conventionally, like in a conflict that was not nuclear but just conventional, it depends. Obviously, they've shown that they can fight in Ukraine, but in Ukraine they've also shown that they have a somewhat limited ability to project force outside their own borders. So it kind of depends on where your perspective World War III is being fought. Yeah, if it's being fought in the South Pacific, then Russia's not going to do much. I wouldn't worry too much in that case.
all the questions that I had seen so far.
Gotcha. Yeah, even during the Cold War, Russia, then the Soviet Union, did not really have a great capacity to project force beyond its own territory, or perhaps more broadly beyond the Eastern Bloc, such as it was at the time. Like, they did have a navy, but they didn't have very many carriers. In fact, I don't think they had any carriers of note until the late 1980s. That was kind of a new project for them. I think they had some helicopter carriers before that, but those were mostly about anti-submarine warfare rather than, projecting force into another country far away from the Soviet Union. Yeah, most of their influence was more in things like aid, military aid, technical aid, economic aid of one kind or another. That was more what they used to influence other countries, rather than just straight up invading them. Obviously they invaded some countries in Eastern Europe and then Afghanistan as well, but those were all along the border of the Soviet Union. So I don't think they ever invaded anybody that was not on the border with the Soviet Union. I don't think they had the capacity to do that. But they sent a shit ton of weapons to places like Latin America and Africa, gave lots of aid and expertise, training and whatnot to various rebel militias and whatnot in different civil wars. So, they were active, but there was a limit to how much they could tangibly do. They certainly did not have the reach and power of the United States. They could challenge in specific areas like Eastern Europe and then maybe Central Asia and Afghanistan, but not much else besides.
Yeah, because it does present a logistical challenge to project force the further from home you are.
Oh, yeah. It's very expensive. The war in Afghanistan for the United States was massively expensive. That was a very long logistical supply chain.
There was a clarification to the question. They meant more so of, is what Russia is currently doing going to start World War III by bombing close to NATO?
No.
Okay.
No. Yeah, I saw somebody, I guess it was on Reddit. I really shouldn't cite Reddit. That's not exactly an intellectual center of debate. But, that's where you see stuff. That's kind of where you go. So I saw somebody in a Reddit comment saying that, sooner or later, there was a risk, that's what it was, that a Russian missile or something would land in Poland by accident, and then Poland would trigger Article 5, and then that would be World War III, which is stupid, because that's not how Article 5 works. A missile accidentally falling on your territory is not going to be grounds for immediate war. So that's not on the table. Maybe if they really wanted to go to war, they could cite that as a casus belli, but really if they really wanted to go to war, they would not wait for that. They would just go. They don't need a reason in that case. Just the fact that they want to would be enough. But as is, there's a lot of reluctance, specifically because of the possibility of an out of control escalation leading to a nuclear exchange. So, I don't think that the West is biting at the champ. Suddenly I can't remember
chomping
how that
at the
goes.
bit.
Thank you. I don't think the West is chomping at the bit to jump into Ukraine. Much to the chagrin of some of the pro-Ukraine crowd over here. It's not likely to happen. And that's going to be true even if there is a reason given, like, say, an accidental airstrike or missile strike, something, or some such thing on NATO territory. Willpower is more relevant and important than facts on the ground. If NATO really wanted to fuck up Russia and Ukraine, there's not a lot Russia could actually tangibly do to stop it, short of nuclear war. But the other side of that coin is that if NATO really doesn't want to get involved in Ukraine, that suggests that Russia has a lot more leeway. There's a lot more room that's going to be given for accidents and things like that. So nobody's really worried about that, at least within the governments. Obviously, a lot of regular people are worried about accidents being potential grounds for escalation. But as is, neither Russia or the West is really looking to significantly escalate the conflict to the point where they're actually fighting each other. Like, that's not in either side's interest. Russia can't win an out-and-out actual military conflict with NATO. And as far as NATO countries, it would be very expensive and politically unpopular. So both sides have a reason not to do it. So it's going to take more than just some accidents to make it happen. So no, that's not going to lead to World War III. And I don't think the current trajectory of the conflict in Ukraine is one that leads to World War III. If there were like a breakout, that is to say, by the Russian army in eastern Ukraine, in which the Ukrainian army just collapses and the Russians blitz on Kiev and whatever, and just grab the country, I think there would be discussion about potential intervention by NATO, but I suspect that ultimately they would decide not to. And I think the evidence for that is just the earliest stages of the war in Ukraine. Because keep in mind, the expectation when the war started, even amongst governments in the West, was that Ukraine would just get steamrolled. They fully expected the Russian army to steamroll the Ukrainian army, to roll into Kiev, to take the country, and that Russia was just going to do what it wanted. And I think there was going to be some discussion about the degree to which the West might support some kind of resistance in Ukraine, maybe more, maybe less. But I don't think anybody was expecting to spend, tens of billions of dollars sending conventional weaponry to a Ukrainian army that had not collapsed. I don't think anybody was planning on that. Nobody expected that. And I think that kind of betrays the fact that the West, while it did not want Ukraine to be invaded, was also kind of okay with it. That eventuality would resolve the issue, so to speak, and could be grounds for a new status quo in Europe. Obviously, there would have been sanctions, whatnot, and again, there would have been tension in the relationship with Russia over whatever degree of support the West provided to resistance groups in what would have been an occupied Ukraine. But there also would not have likely then been an attempt by the West to try to prop up, an actual army that was actively fighting the Russians. Like, that would not have been on the table. So I suspect that Europe would have punished Russia to some degree economically, maybe significant sanctions, much more than had been the case in 2014, and possibly a gas cutoff. That's more debatable. But it also would have made peace with it eventually. Maybe 5 to 10 years, and there would have been something resembling normalization. So really, full credit has to go to the Ukrainian army there for not folding. By shocking the world, they really changed the whole dynamic of the conflict. It went from being, what do we do about occupied Ukraine, to what do we do to help Ukraine survive? Mm-hmm. And that's a radically different proposition. So that's full credit there. They deserve that. But the fact that the West was probably willing to just kind of look the other way for the most part suggests to me that even if Russia did break out and significantly change the trajectory of the conflict in a way favorable to themselves, the West would probably just revert to that previous position of tacitly kind of being okay with it.
Gotcha. Makes sense.
Yeah, I don't see a lot of pathways to like an actual nuclear exchange. Obviously, if the NATO invaded Russia, that would be like clear-cut grounds for nuclear retaliation. But NATO intervention in Ukraine, like even something that extreme, might not necessarily be enough to trigger nuclear weapons on the Russian side. Because, if Russians start using them, then the West is going to use them too. And that isn't going to end any better for Russia than it will for the West. And, I feel in my bones what's going to happen. Somebody in chat is going to point out Russia has a lot more tactical nuclear weapons than Western armies do. So if it came down to a tac nuke fight in eastern Ukraine, would not the Russians win? And to that I would say, how many nuclear weapons do you need to obliterate an army, right? So Russia may have a quantitative advantage there, but you don't need that many nuclear weapons to obliterate Russian armies in the field in eastern Ukraine. So even if the Russians have more, that just means they're going to be able to nuke the rubble more. There's not going to be much left on either side after a nuclear exchange, even at a small, localized, tactical level like that. So, I don't think that goes well for anybody. But I also don't think the Russian government really wants to do that in any case, because that runs the possibility of escalating into a general strategic nuclear exchange. And I don't think even Russia, specifically, I don't think even the Russian government thinks Ukraine is worth that. So, the only possibility to nuclear exchange that I think is really credible is if people start making mistakes. Like if people really start escalating rapidly, and then maybe somebody interprets that wrongly as an attempt to significantly change the conflict. And not only to significantly change the trajectory of the conflict, but in a way that would pave the way for intervention. And then, even then, I think there would have to be evidence that the other side was planning to significantly expand the conflict beyond Ukraine. Like, at that point, if there were a series of misperceptions that the war was going to be expanded into Russia or maybe into NATO, that could conceivably lead to a kind of preemptive nuclear exchange, or lead to the introduction of nuclear weapons that could lead to a tit-for-tat that results eventually in a nuclear exchange. But beyond that, I'm pretty skeptical. But I could be wrong. Maybe we're just like a heartbeat away from, nuclear holocaust. Who's to say? Like, I cannot conclusively say for sure that that's not the case.
Time will tell.
So, yeah, we'll see if we all die or not. That time remains to be seen.
Well, so we'll have to find out from Joe Rogan if Bigfoot is real, but it seems like World War III is not really in the best interest of the players in the game right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I've noticed some Russians, specifically Russian nationalists, generally like to point out that, if Russia did, they like to point to the Cuban Missile Crisis specifically. Look at that. So why isn't it okay that we're doing that? But, keep in mind that the result of the Cuban Missile Crisis was that war was averted, for one. And two, specifically, Cuba got to keep its government. It got to stay aligned with the Soviet Union. And was otherwise left more or less alone for the duration of the Cold War. Mm-hmm. There were attempts to kill Castro, obviously, and there were continued economic sanctions by the United States. But the U.S. government didn't try to invade or otherwise overthrow the Cuban government beyond that point. Mm-hmm. So we did recognize the independence and sovereignty of Cuba. So the situations are not entirely comparable then. We're in Ukraine, we're already at the stage of war. That's already broken out. And it seems the Russian government does not really consider an independent, sovereign Ukraine to be fully acceptable.
Makes sense.
So it's kind of an apples and oranges comparison at this point.
Thanks, Chad, for watching as we try to sift through the situations in the world and see what people will do. It's very hard to predict the future, given all the different variables at play. It's interesting to see how the U.S. election has a pretty major investment for certain actors, try to figure out if it suits them to try to get Americans to vote one way or the other.
Yeah, and they're billion-dollar affairs at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Big money. Correspondingly big stakes, so not surprising. When was the last time we talked about Latin America?
I think we talked about some deals in Argentina pretty recently, but that was last week.
There's an election in Mexico right now.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, well, maybe not right now, but that's coming. It's an election year. Yeah, it's a big deal because the current president, Obrador, is a populist. but he also can't run for another term because there's a one-term presidential term limit.
Mm-hmm.
And so his successor is kind of an interesting choice. For one, it's a woman, which is unusual. There's not very many female leaders in Latin America. I think it's been done, but it doesn't happen very often. So that was notable. I think she's Jewish, which is also notable. Uh, and also, I think she was the mayor of Mexico City, if I'm not mistaken. Somebody in chat, please correct me on that. But yeah, it's looking likely that she is going to win. So there probably will be continued populist rule, so to speak, in Mexico, at least as far as the presidency. I think there is like an attempt by the opposition to put forward a decent candidate, but I don't recall anybody saying that it was likely that she would win. It seems the consensus is that Obrador's successor has it in the bag. So, not a whole lot of drama in that sense. It kind of seems like it's all pretty preordained.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, in so much as populist rule means that there's going to be continued issues in the Mexican economy, it could be a problem later. It just depends on what she does. Obrador had kind of been doing some popular things, like he raised minimum wage, he was spending more money on the poor, that kind of stuff. But he was also doing things like renationalizing the oil industry, taking authority with regard to healthcare away from states, trying to fiddle with the electoral system. He's doing a lot of things to kind of centralize power in the national government. And, that can work out if it's done well. But the suspicion is that he wasn't doing it to do it well so much as he was doing it so that he could distribute patronage and also secure his own party's longevity in office. So, if his successor continues to do stuff like that, then eventually economic performance is going to start to suffer. Mexico is kind of getting by on a lot of the re-export trade from East Asia. A lot of stuff from China that is getting tariffed by the United States now just goes through countries like Vietnam and Mexico before being re-exported into the United States to get around the tariffs. So that's led to a small renaissance in Mexican investment. It's not just that goods are exported out of Asia into Mexico and then the United States. There's a lot of Chinese companies that are actually investing in factories in northern Mexico so that they can produce for the North American market, mostly the US, but to a lesser degree Mexico as well. And that's got some of the anti-free trade people in the United States a little worked up. If Trump does win, there could be a problem, to put it mildly, as far as Mexican-American relations with regard to trade, specifically because of the Chinese re-export trade through Mexico. But for now, the Mexican government is just leveraging it to the hilt. They don't give a shit. They're happy to make money off of it. But that's masking some of the deeper problems within the economy. Things like the oil industry are not doing especially well. Last I checked, anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And there are bright spots, but in general, there's still not enough work. Wages have been increasing, but they could be doing better. It's just, and I mean, the main problem really is just the institutions. There's still too much corruption. There's still too much violence. The fundamentals really need to be addressed and improved if Mexico's economy is ever really going to take off and move into its really next bracket of development, so to speak. If they really want to move up GDP per capita, quality of life, standard of living, institutions have to improve. And that's a tall order. It's really hard changing the culture of institutions, especially ones that have been around a long time. In that struggle, in that regard, they share that struggle with China, which has a very similar problem. Although it's much worse in China than it is in Mexico, I would argue. So we'll see what happens in Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
For now, they're doing pretty good. Economy is doing okay. The government has kind of restored its legitimacy via certain populist measures done by Obrador, but Whether or not that's sustainable in the long run remains to be seen.
We'll see what happens with them.
And Guatemala had an election last year, and the reformist candidate actually won. And the establishment really did not like that very much. The attorney general almost immediately started trying to find reasons to disqualify the presidential winner, the woman who won the presidency. And it seemed clear after a couple failed attempts that they were just fishing for a reason to prevent her from taking office. And Washington actually kind of had to come down and release a statement basically telling them to stop. I don't think they did. It kind of puts to lie the notion that they're all just puppet governments of the American empire. Not really. They pretty much do what they want. If the U.S. tells them to do something that they don't want to do, generally they just lie. That's generally the go-to maneuver. And because Washington doesn't really pay attention to Central America, they very frequently get away with it. So, they tried to stop her from taking office. It didn't work. She eventually did take office and become the next president. But it's unclear, even having succeeded at that, if she's going to be able to overcome what's going to be broad-based institutional resistance to significant change. And Guatemala does not have a great track record as far as reformist presidents. They've had a couple over the past 20 years, and most of them did not pan out very well. I'm reminded of the story about the anti-corruption agency, which successive reformist presidents watered down and weakened after the anti-corruption agency started making allegations that those presidents had engaged in corruption. Suddenly, it wasn't so important to allow and maintain the independence of the anti-corruption agency. Happened twice in a row. So I can understand if people are a little bit pessimistic about prospects for reform in the country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, corruption is also a norm, and norms are pretty hard and difficult to change.
Mm.
It takes quite a while of just people seeing the issue differently, because at its core, corruption is kind of like an immediate benefit to the person who is corrupt. Like, you get more opportunities to make money and gain influence for yourself. You're breaking certain rules to do so, but if people perceive that as hey, that's your chance to make something for you, then it's going to be something that people aren't really assessing within themselves as negative. Whereas when we're looking at other countries and we have our beliefs about why you should respect those norms and that kind of thing, it seems bad, but for the person in the short term, it seems good. They're giving me a nasty deal that benefits me greatly. Where's the downside?
Yeah. I think did we have any questions?
Fuzzy Cord's here. I'm not sure if he's passed anything along yet.
I think there was a couple we didn't get to last time.
Hmm. Yeah,
Let's see. I don't know if this guy is still here, but I thought this was an interesting one for me anyway. The question was, is there any news on the East African Federation effort, thoughts on the effort, possible ramifications of a new African economic superpower on the continent? Yeah, you don't get a lot of questions about East Africa on here, so I thought that was pretty cool. I wished I'd gotten to the question last time, because it's almost certainly the case that he's not still here. So too bad. But yeah, that's for those of you who don't know, there is an attempt in East Africa, maybe not even so much East Africa, it's more like the Great Lakes region, but that's sort of in the eastern part of Africa. There's an attempt by countries in that region to form a federation that will have some supranational power, kind of similar to the European Union. And the idea is to create a larger single market that industries and individual countries will be able to take advantage of and scale up and generate more economic growth, more opportunities, etc. And so that federation was created, I want to say like 30, 40 years ago ish, something in that range. And, the development of its supranational institutions of government have kind of waxed and waned with time. By and large, the member states, kind of like in the European Union, have still largely maintained their sovereignty. There hasn't been a lot of powers granted to the new institution, the new federation. But it does kind of continue to grow bit by bit. I think Somalia was allowed to join recently, which is not saying much. As we've discussed before, the government of Somalia is basically just the office of the mayor of Mogadishu. So pretty small overall, not really representative of Somalia generally. So it kind of more of a forward-looking move than anything. You can't really join now, but we're technically going to allow you to join so that when you eventually do actually govern your country again, you will be a fully fledged member. So it's continued, but there hasn't been a lot of new big developments with regard to the Federation, at least not to my knowledge. As far as thoughts on the effort, I think it's a good idea. It's always good when you can reduce trade barriers between countries, especially countries that are neighboring each other. There's a lot of economic growth you can get just at a local level by opening up borders. So that opens up doors, opportunities, whatnot. Also, it just makes sense as far as overall economic development. Just barriers like that are just artificial anyway. They're only going to impede the develop. I mean, I'm speaking in terms of small countries. Small countries very much hurt in terms of the lack of scale. It's hard to be an industry. It's hard to develop a big modern industry in a small country that does not have access to larger markets, or certainly not neighboring markets. So if you can increase the available size of the market that your firms can operate in, especially in terms of neighboring markets, that's much to your own benefit in terms of economic development. So, the Federation is a good idea in that sense. In terms of political unification, maybe it could be a good idea. It just depends on the degree of rule of law that they can establish. Like if it just becomes a vehicle for national dictators to, continue to steal money, then it's not going to amount to much. So, what direction they take with it in terms of formalizing and professionalizing the Federation bureaucracy is going to determine how effective it is at doing, much of anything. And as far as possible ramifications of a new African economic superpower, I guess there's two answers to that. One, the Federation is not going to be a new economic superpower. Even if everything goes right, there's still so far to go in terms of improving the quality of institutions, reducing corruption. That's a generational project that's going to last a long time. So I think even if the Federation does well overall in terms of actually unifying, having a supranational institution that all of the member states respect, having a single market, that's not going to translate into superpowerdom, economic superpowerdom. There's just way more that would have to happen. But the second answer to that question is, what are the implications of a hypothetical new African economic superpower on the continent? I mean, it's pretty much intuitive, right? That's just going to raise economic activity across the continent. It's going to create a new focal point, a new economic pole of activity in the global economy that'll draw in investment and workers and whatnot. So, migrant workers from the poorer parts of Africa, they would travel there for work. The money they sent back home would increase quality of life. They would build better homes. They'd pay for better education for their kids. There would be better human capital as a result. And that would translate into more entrepreneurship, more skilled labor, more investment that provides jobs for that skilled labor. It would be what in economics is called a virtuous cycle. So, that would just be from migrant labor. The capital that would be brought in terms of investment would significantly raise economic activity and whatnot. So I'm assuming by economic superpower, you mean the full package, not just natural resources and exports thereof, but also some degree of manufacturing, rule of law, good government institutions, a strong or at least robust services sector. All of that stuff in one package in Africa somewhere would be
and also military.
Well, the questioner specifically said economic superpower.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So that's what I'm thinking of in terms of the full package. So that would be very transformative for Africa as a whole, not just for the region that was able to become that economic superpower. So the ramifications would be broad and deep if a region in Africa could actually pull that off. And that's to say nothing of the broader geopolitics of a new major power of some kind emerging. But that's so hypothetical that it's hard to even gauge what that would. It would depend on what region of Africa they were in. It would depend on their political predilections, ideologies, a whole lot of questions there that would need to be answered first before you could even really forecast that. So I can't really answer that significantly in depth, but I can recommend an anime, which is just as good. It's a Jin Urabuchi anime, so you know it's good if you're a fan of Urabuchi anyway. It's called Oblivion. It was basically a short series. I think it was only like 12 some episodes or something. And the episodes are very short. I think they're only like 10, 15 minutes each, I want to say. But it had a really cool premise, which is that aliens come to visit Earth. They make first contact. But instead of trying to colonize Earth or going to war with Earth, all they want to do is trade. And so what they want is just basic materials. They want raw resources like, I think it was lime or something. Just something, a very common mineral is what they wanted. And in exchange, they were willing to trade these really advanced robots that were very, multifaceted. You could kind of use them for anything. And the thing was, they were willing to give like a lot of robots to anybody who was willing to give them just basic minerals. And again, these minerals were so basic that everybody had them. So what it meant is that everybody on the planet, from like the poorest countries to the richest countries, were able to get control of advanced alien technology, these advanced robots. And so the whole series is basically a series of vignettes exploring the kind of broad military, economic, and political impact that this structural change in global affairs, economic and political, would have. So it's actually a really cool series. It's pretty well thought out. I don't always agree with some of the conclusions. Some of them were a little bit of a stretch, but it definitely made me think. So pretty strong recommend there.
Interesting. Yeah, aliens come to Earth situations can be very different how they're portrayed. Did you ever see District 9?
Oh, I saw it multiple times.
Nice.
And I took some friends to go see it.
Aliens come to Earth and they really love cat food.
Yeah, District 9 and Oblivion are probably some of the more unique takes on First Contact, I would say. Because it's almost always just some kind of Independence Day type conflagration, right? Aliens come and everything goes to shit.
Yeah.
Yeah, other possibilities are not explored as much in media. Probably more common in books, but not so much media, like movies and whatnot. But I just thought of Oblivion because, if there were an economic superpower in Africa, that would be the kind of structural economic change that would, completely reorient the region in a whole myriad of ways.
So we'll see. Who are the frontrunners right now in Africa economically? South Africa, Nigeria.
How do we want to define front runner?
Biggest economies currently.
Just general GDP, just size of GDP.
Yeah,
okay.
Sure.
I'm gonna go South Africa, like you say. Nigeria, Ethiopia. I'm going to say those are the biggest. Egypt probably would be up there too. But when people say Africa, they intuitively generally are thinking of sub-Saharan Africa, even though North Africa is, part of Africa.
Yeah.
Just the fact that they're Arab instead of, Black African generally kind of puts them more in the Middle East category.
Yeah, ethnically and religiously, they're more Middle Eastern country.
Yeah, so South Africa, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Egypt, I guess, would be the top four. So yeah, you were pretty much spot on in terms of size of GDP.
Cool.
In terms of actual economic development, though, it's a little bit different because generally South Africa has been in decline for a while. They've had a lot of problems. They're having issues with brownouts and whatnot, shortages of electricity, in other words. It's pretty common for people just not to have electricity in South Africa for several hours every day. That's just how bad management of the electrical utilities has been. Still a higher standard of living in the most developed parts of South Africa than you'll see virtually anywhere else on the continent. So, points for that, but the trend has been pretty negative. So beyond South Africa, though, the most developed parts of Africa, I'm going to focus on sub-Saharan Africa here. Ghana actually is probably the highest. They've done a pretty good job with managing their economy since independence. They've had their ups and downs, they've had issues, but by and large, they've been probably the single standout performer in terms of economic growth and development. Other countries are bigger, but they haven't been able to get as much. They haven't been able to leverage that size into as much development as Ghana has. If you go to Angola, the capital city is very developed. It's one of the most expensive cities in the world, technically. That's largely just from oil exports. There's a gaggle of countries in Central West Africa that actually export a lot of oil, and so they make obviously significant amount of money from that. But generally, the money just stays either in the family that rules the country or in the capital. And so in Angola's case, most of the money has stayed in and around the capital. So if all you want to do is go to the capital of Angola, very, very nice. You can rank that as one of the more developed parts of Africa. But then if you go outside of the capital, it kind of goes downhill pretty quickly. So a pretty big urban-rural divide, you might say, in Angola correspondingly. Eastern Africa, Kenya has done really well. So its overall GDP is not as big as other countries in the continent, but in terms of development, they've been pretty strong performers. I don't think they've done as well as Ghana, but they would definitely rank amongst the top performers in terms of just growth and overall development. So big points to Kenya. And Tanzania has done pretty reasonable, but I don't think they've generated as much growth. Last I checked, anyway. Oh, and I can't forget Rwanda. Rwanda has been probably the fastest growing economy in sub-Saharan Africa over the past 20-some years, I want to say.
I remember you mentioning that, yeah.
Yeah, they've been very strong performers there. I don't think they've made it as far as Ghana yet, but they've come a long way from the genocide back in the 90s. So, they get extra points for that, because that's definitely a big barrier to overcome.
The Most Improved Award.
Yeah. Pretty low bar to clear, but they cleared it pretty strongly. They're not committing genocide anymore.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess those would be my picks for best economy, in terms of development and growth. Ghana, Rwanda, Kenya, and then I guess asterisk and Angola. In terms of, again, standard of living, South Africa is probably still, the leader. But again, that's just very specific parts of South Africa. And again, they're kind of in a period of decline right now. So South Africa is really kind of in a category of its own. It is a very weird, unusual country. So it's a little hard to compare them with some of the other parts of Africa.
Brownouts would be really annoying if I was a streamer. Power just randomly going out, broadcast going down, everything broken.
So what you would do, what people in these countries do, not just in Africa, but any country where there's issues with the supply of electricity, is that you would buy a power generator. And what you would do is that you would set it up to kick on like the second that the power goes out. You would also probably have, I don't remember what it's called, but there's a gadget you can buy that you connect your power supply to for your computer. And if the power goes out, there's a battery in it that'll keep the computer going, either until you turn the computer off or until you get a new power supply. So you would get one of those if you were a streamer, and you would have the generator ready to go for when the power went out. Now, that wouldn't necessarily save you if the router through which all of your data is going through, if that shuts down, then not much you can do. And I don't mean like your home router. I mean like the overall internet, the telecommunications network. Like if that equipment loses power, then it doesn't matter if your PC is still working. You're obviously not going to be able to get online and stream. Maybe at that point you use Starlink or something.
True.
I don't think there's a lot of other options at that point. But there are ways to mitigate the risk, and electrical generators are definitely big business in places like Iraq, or pretty much anywhere where there's power supply issues. It just becomes normal. I remember back during the Iraq War, I remember reading articles about how people were adjusting to the lack of electricity, and the reporters were saying that there were electrical generators on every block, and that people on the block would basically just pay money to the guy on the block that ran the generator, and they would turn it on whenever the power went out.
The people will make a business around it.
Yeah. Economy, economic activity is very robust. People will adjust to just about anything. So, electrical generators kind of give you a way around that. So in turn, there's a market for it. So, people do get their electricity. That's not to say that it would not be better if they did not have to rely on generators so much. Obviously it's still disruptive to have the power go out intermittently. And generators are still invariably going to be more expensive, whether you're running your own or renting from somebody else, either the generator itself or just renting the power from somebody else's generator. That's going to be more expensive than just getting it from a public utility. So it's still disruptive. It still creates friction in the economy that lowers overall economic performance. And in that sense, it would be better off not to have the shortages than to have them. But if you are going to have shortages, generators give you a way around that. So it is doable, just more expensive.
Gotcha. Chat also asked, how is the DRC doing?
I think people are still dying in eastern DRC. I think that kerfuffle with the militias supported by Rwanda is still ongoing. I haven't read any updates about it, though, so I don't think it's escalated. That would be my inference. Yeah, just reviewing BBC Africa, I don't see anything on it. Oh, there's something about Apple. Who cares? Yeah. I think having not had an update, I can't say for sure, because Africa kind of gets short shrift in international media. But I presume that the pre-existing conflict with the militias has continued, but that it has not escalated. That's probably the best I could do on that one. But if you want to look at areas of DR Congo other than North Kivu, the sort of the broad-based PvP conflict zone that is Eastern DRC. The rest of it is doing okay. Southern DRC makes a lot of money exporting natural resources. They're doing pretty good. I think they export a lot of copper. And then the West is doing okay. That's a major urban center. The capital of DR Congo is a city called Kinshasa, and it's a megacity of like 10 million people, I want to say. Let me check. Oh, 17 million. Okay. I was off by a little bit. Yeah, very large city. Last I checked, it's actually the second largest French-speaking city on the planet.
Today we learned.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's got its problems. There's obviously the average wage is not very high. It suffers the problems that a lot of major megacities in the developing world have, which is that there's a lot of people who live in extreme poverty on the margins of the city. And overall economic activity is not really defined nearly as much by high-income work as equivalent cities in places like the West. So, there's definitely issues, but I mean, as far as African cities go, it does okay. Again, it's not defined by the violence in the east of the country, so it's not like this just war-torn area like Haiti, for example, that people might assume it is just because it's in Africa or in DRC. So it's doing okay. But the one region that is not doing okay is, just continues to be mired in internecine militia conflict of one kind or another. So, that much has not gone well. But at the very least, that's remained contained to the one region for the moment. So the rest of the country has continued more or less as it was before. I'm sorry if the sniffling is loud. I was listening to myself the last time and I was a little bit perturbed. I did not realize how loud that was. I didn't think the mic would pick that up.
The Blue Yeti, able to pick up any sniffle.
Well, it was especially bad last week because I had allergies. For those of you who don't know, Texas, and specifically North Texas, is the worst region in the United States for people with allergies. Pollen counts are very, very high here, especially in spring, which is exactly where we are right now. So if my allergies ever kick off, that's why. They're doing better today, so not as much of an issue, but they were definitely going off the last time we did this.
Well, you are not at fault for your normal reactions to stuff. It's okay. Yeah, it can be kind of silly how our bodies overreact to stuff that isn't technically dangerous to us, but it activates our self-defense mechanisms.
Yeah, allergies can be rough like that. Maybe I should have spent more time outside as a kid.
I don't know. I was pretty nerdy myself, played a good deal of video games.
Well, you did play football, right?
Oh yeah, I did sports.
Yeah, that's an outside thing.
True.
Although I guess I was in marching band for a while. I don't know what to tell you. I guess I just have a sensitive nose. It sucks. It's especially bad because it gets the worst. Well, I should say it was especially bad in college because pollen season really hits in North Texas like right around the time of final exams. So that's, final exams are stressful and difficult as is, but it's even worse when your nose is just dying. It's just going absolutely batshit. And they had all of these oak trees at UT Dallas that you had to walk by when you were walking around campus. And during pollen season, they would just release massive, biological warfare levels of pollen. And it just killed me. So yeah, final exams were hard back in the day. I do not miss that at all. Some things about college I miss, not that.
Add an environmental challenge to your normal studies.
I read some trivia a couple months ago that one of the reasons there's so much pollen not just in North Texas, but in the United States broadly, is because there was a big movement like 100 years ago or something to only plant trees that were male, as opposed to female trees, which drop lots of seeds and stuff. Because apparently people didn't like cleaning up the seeds, because it was kind of unsightly not to clean them up. So people started just planting male trees. But the result of having nothing but male trees is that you have way, way more pollen. Mm-hmm. So part of the reason that those of us with allergy problems suffer so much, especially in pollen season in the United States, is because people 100 years ago were really fucking lazy. Mm-hmm. Thanks, guys. Much appreciated.
We didn't want the grounds to be sullied with that stuff. But that's half the species. It helps the other stuff exist. No, they make garbage. We don't want those.
Oh, the bastards. If only I could have revenge. That's probably not the reason I have allergy problems, but it contributes. So like any American, I reserve the right to be irrationally upset about it.
Sure. People have their opinions and they hold them strongly.
Let's see, we did have another question. How seriously do I take Trump's private discussions of invading Mexico to act against drug cartels? I don't think those were private discussions. I think he was pretty open about that. It was certainly reported. I remember it being reported anyway. It's a dumb idea. Using military force against Mexican cartels is very, very unwise. For one, the government of Mexico is not going to be able to accept that. That's going to create a big nationalist backlash in Mexico. So then you're going to have not only the problem of cartels, which is the problem you started with, but then you're going to have the problem of a very upset and uncooperative Mexican government. And, however corrupt the Mexican government may be, they can definitely make efforts to fight the cartels way more difficult by not cooperating. So, it would be better to try to cooperate even with a flawed partner like the Mexican government than to try to impose violence on sovereign Mexican territory. And I would point out, too, that cartels are not really a problem that you can solve with bombs or special forces or whatever military tool of choice you may prefer. It's kind of like terrorism. You can blow them up all you want, but, you're just going to get more later. That's not to say that there's not room for action. Obviously, drug enforcement measures, the Drug Enforcement Agency does a lot of stuff to try to curtail the entry of drugs into the United States, cooperates with the Mexican government on the cartel problem, but those are law enforcement agencies. They're designed to do that. The military as an institution is not designed to tackle difficult social problems like drug use or human trafficking or drug smuggling. The military is designed to break shit. That's what it does the best. You can try to get it to do other stuff, but generally that's just going to result in a lot of people lying to you. We saw that in Vietnam and Afghanistan. Like, if you give the military a mission that it cannot really actually complete, the military is not going to tell you that it can't do that and that you need to give it a different mission, right? That's not its job. It's not even really allowed to do that. Like, the civilian government has to be respected. If there is going to be a civil-military divide, and if the military is going to stay in its place, so to speak, as subservient to civilian leadership, they can't just tell civilian leadership that they're being dumb and giving them an impossible mission. So what the military will do instead is that it'll try its best to do the mission, and if it can't, which it won't because it's impossible, then it'll just sort of distort things to make it look like it's going relatively well. The upper echelon of the military is kind of similar to the upper echelon of business, in the sense that if you can't get done what you need to get done, then you just misrepresent it to the point that it looks like you're getting done what you need to get done so that you can scrape by and get promoted. There's kind of a similar dynamic with officers in the military trying to get promoted. Ideally, you just get done what you need to get done, you do your job well, etc. But, sometimes you're put in an impossible position. And in those cases, if it comes down to just failing and being punished or misrepresenting and being rewarded, if those are the only two choices, you're going to go with the latter. So that's what you're going to end up with if you use the military against cartels in Mexico. Like, there's some things that they'll be able to do, but for the most part, it's going to be self-defeating. And eventually they'll just turn into a perpetual forever war, which I think at this point people are pretty tired of. Not a great idea. Like, even the war on drugs at this point is pretty unpopular. Like, I think drugs won the war on drugs. That's the joke in the United States we have. So that hasn't gone well either. So, I think it's a dumb idea that just way over. It's a simple solution to a complex problem of exactly the kind that populists all over the world are known for providing. It's not. You're never going to one easy trick your way through a difficult problem like drug trafficking or cartels. Like, it's not going to happen, 100%. If you want to spend more money and resources on the drug problem, and specifically on dealing with drug cartels in Mexico, fine. Like, in principle, I'm not opposed to that. That's a perfectly valid position to have. But if you're going to do it, it should be law enforcement agencies, not the military, because law enforcement agencies have the nuance and training and expertise to actually tangibly deal with that problem. In so much as there is a military element to that, certainly that could happen. There's room for that. But in that case, you can largely just do that through the Mexican military. And if you really think the Mexican military is not up for it, then just ask the Mexican government to allow advisors or special forces or something to come into Mexico and have them do it. That'll probably be a secret deal. I don't think the Mexican government could be open about that. But we've had deals like that in the past. We had a similar dynamic with Pakistan during the height of the war on terror. So that's doable. But like, just full-throated military intervention in Mexico, that's not going to work. Like, that's just belligerently stupid. To the point where I don't even think Trump is serious when he says that. I think that's just a talking point and to win votes from people who are upset about the immigration issue in the United States.
People like to talk a big game. Gives them clicks. Gives them traction.
Let's see. What did I think about the presidential immunity case and the broader implications of the Supreme Court decision, if this hasn't already been talked about? It has not been already talked about. But I'm just going to cut to the chase here on this question, because this is the type of question we've had issues with in the past. I am not a lawyer. And for those of you who have been listening a long time, are painfully aware of that fact, because I have made it painfully blatant that I am not a lawyer or that I have no legal background on multiple occasions. So instead of embarrassing myself again on a question of legal significance here, I'm just going to say I don't really know. I haven't been following it closely. That's the real answer to this question. I'll try to justify that, though, and say that it doesn't really matter as far as the election, which I think a lot of people are paying attention to. I would point out, too, that yes, saying that the president has broad-based immunity does have significant repercussions for the long term, but it's specifically for that reason that I'm kind of dubious that the Supreme Court is going to grant that. I suspect they will, as they have on previous controversial cases of note, probably give a very narrow ruling that does not have broad significance for the long term. In other words, one that does not have broad ramifications. So they'll probably rule that presidential immunity is broad in certain areas, but is not infinite, and they'll leave ambiguous as to just where the boundaries are regarding presidential immunity. So I do think some of the hyperventilating online about just infinite presidential immunity is not entirely justified. I don't think, given what I've read thus far, the court is leaning in that direction.
But we have noticed a power creep for the executive office for some time.
Leviathan. Yeah, the executive branch has definitely, over the past half century, become progressively more and more powerful relative to the other two branches. Mm-hmm. So how to resolve that problem is a bigger macro, big picture problem that nobody has really been able to derive an answer for, mostly because whenever people complain about it, they eventually get into power, and then it ceases to be a problem because they're the ones in power. So long as that's the case, it's going to be very difficult to try to significantly address that. But yeah, that is a long-term problem and thorny issue there. No easy solutions.
Doing pretty well on time. Got another 45 minutes or so.
Well, Fuzzy Cord did ask last week, what's your favorite example of the quote-unquote law of unintended consequences? I don't think I have a favorite, because almost all of them are depressing. I don't know how many I could remember off the top of my head, though. I don't know, the purge of the Red Army in the 1930s? That went pretty badly. That was supposed to be about consolidating the control of the regime, specific Stalin and his cohort. I don't think he intended for that to quite kneecap the Red Army the way it did for when the war started. So you could say that was an unintended consequence. I mean, I'm sure everybody would have a good example of that, but I'm struggling to come up with good ones. Yeah, history is kind of my go-to reference there, but there's lots of public policy ones. I remember there was one in the 60s. This has to do with public housing, the creation of what we would now call the projects. There was a big push to set up housing for poor people in the 1960s. But one of the things they wanted to do was to narrow it to specific groups. So one of the rules they had is that you could not qualify for the public housing if you were not single, specifically a single woman, because they wanted this particular batch of public housing to be just for single poor women. I think even mothers, single poor mothers specifically, is what it was. And the result was not that the housing only went to single poor mothers. Rather, the result is that a lot of mothers who were not single ended up separating from the fathers of their children so that they could qualify.
Interesting.
Which was definitely an unintended consequence.
Look, babe, I'm not mad at you. I'm just doing this for the benefits. It's funny.
Yeah, they were struggling. They were having a hard time getting by. And so the housing was considered attractive enough a proposition. The public housing was considered an attractive enough position that separation was ultimately preferable. And I don't know if that separation was always permanent. In some cases, it was probably just, symbolic. Oh yeah, I'm technically single, whatever. But the result was the same, which is that they ended up with a lot of, broken families that they did not have before the policy happened. So, state-sanctioned breaking up of families is definitely not what they were going for.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a public policy example. We had a military example. I don't know. Is New Coke an example of unintended consequences? Not really. That was just a bad business decision, right?
What's
I tried to think of one. Have you heard of New Coke? The story behind New Coke?
No. What is that?
Oh, wow. Okay. You'll enjoy this. This is stupid. Back in the 1980s, Coca-Cola wanted to shake things up, try to generate some new growth, some new PR. So they created a new recipe for Coca-Cola, and they called it New Coke. And they actually tried to replace their old recipe with it. They had this big this big ad campaign talking about New Coke, and they were going to release it. It was going to be the new hot thing in, the soft drink world anyway. And so they released it, and everybody hated it. It was a big disaster for them because they had invested heavily in the new drink and the production thereof. And so when it bombed, they had to reverse all of that and revert back to the old recipe. Yeah. It's one of the big blunders in the history of American business. But that's not really unintended consequences. So what's a good business story involving unintended consequences? I don't know, maybe what was it? Was it Tumblr that
Oh, yeah,
started
yeah.
out like they were just about they were it started out as just like a place for normal social media activity, and instead it became like a big nerve center for porn.
Yep. And then they banned porn.
Yeah, they gutted their business
Yep.
by banning the porn. Yeah, so there you could consider maybe that an unintended consequence to a degree. I'm sure Chad is coming up with better examples than I'm coming up with. But yeah, I don't know that I would have a favorite, so I don't know that I can fully answer the question to his satisfaction.
Agent Smith is simply too impartial.
Let's see. I think that's it. I think that's it for questions.
Nice. I didn't see a ton of noise throughout the week in terms of a new item aside from TikTok, because a lot of people are wondering about their videos and stuff and where they're going to browse, because a lot of people even in the US make their living from TikTok videos and so on. So what will they have to do? Will they have to move platforms and such? And then other people just kind of wondering about the ramifications of the next round of voting. I think that's something that is now a recent tradition of we get to dread the election together.
Unfortunately so.
We will ride this out together, chat. It's okay.
Well, let's see. We were doing what? I talked about Mexico, Guatemala.
Talking about Africa for a while.
Well, I was going to go through Latin America. What was what's south of Guatemala? El Salvador. I think we've talked about El Salvador before, right? World's coolest dictator.
Yeah.
Yeah, that guy. He's still going strong down there. But I don't think I've heard anything new out of El Salvador recently. Honduras has a new president, but they've had her for a while. I think she was elected last year, so that's not really news per se. And she was a left-wing reformist candidate, so she was definitely a break from the usual in Honduras. You know, the establishment, sort of conservatives in the country generally monopolized power, so it was definitely a significant change that she was able to win. But I don't know how much she's been able to accomplish. Nicaragua still has Ortega in power. It's one of those sort of soft, Chavista, authoritarian type countries.
Mm-hmm.
It's not as authoritarian as like North Korea. You know, they still do have a lot of freedoms to one degree or another, but it's definitely less free than most countries in the region. You know, there is definitely political repression, mass protests, what have you. And Nicaragua also suffers from the penalty of being the poorest country in Central America. So it's a little rough right now as a result. But I haven't heard any new major developments, so nothing dramatic has happened lately, I don't think. I have no idea what's going on in Costa Rica. There's never any reporting on Costa Rica. The last thing I remember reading about Costa Rica was a presidential election in which there was an evangelical Christian running for president who won.
Mm-hmm.
And then nothing. No other report, no follow-up. So I have no idea.
Huh. That's interesting. My some of my family has done missionary work in Costa Rica, and I would describe them as evangelical Christians. So makes me wonder if they succeeded in their mission.
That could be. Yeah, but if you're going to go do proselytizing, that's a pretty good choice locale to do it in.
Hell yeah, it is. Let me just go to a tropical paradise and talk about the meaning of existence with the locals.
There you go.
Sounds good to me.
It's a very nice location, and they have no army.
Yeah.
They disbanded it 70 years ago,
I
something to
think you
that
told me
effect.
there was some country that's like semi-responsible for looking after them if they do get attacked.
United States.
Okay.
Yeah, Rio Treaty obligation.
It's a pretty nice source of backup.
Yeah, you could do a lot worse than the most powerful country on the planet.
Well, why did we give them that deal?
Well, I mean, the Rio Treaty was just a broader defense treaty that we created to create a regional defense bloc in the Americas. So it originally encompassed pretty much every country in North and South America, or at least every country in North and South America that was independent at the time of signing. So Costa Rica was independent at the time, so they were a signatory.
Chad is asking how you get the messages seen. You can get them seen. I was getting BM'd by a turtling Terran, so I was kind of splitting my attention between multiple things.
I'm guessing Fuzzy Cord messaged me in Discord. The anime is called Obsolete, not Oblivion.
Obsolete. Good correction.
There you go. My mistake. Started with an O of some. It started with an O. I remembered that much. My brain filled in the rest.
It was in the O section of your mental library.
There you go. Obsolete. My apologies. So the anime was called Obsolete.
What would it take for Canada and the US to unite? What would a united North America look like on the world stage?
What would it take? I don't know, like a collapse in Canadian identity? I don't think it's very likely. I don't think many people in Canada look at the United States as something they really want to join. So I don't know, an American invasion? Maybe that would result in unification. The aftermath would probably be pretty messy, though, in that case.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a pretty outlandish prospect. And given how integrated the economies are, there's not really much benefit to it anyway. It's not like there's a lot of barriers to trade. I guess if you cut cut trees for a living, maybe that's a controversial statement. There's always issues about cheap Canadian lumber causing issues in Washington.
Yeah, but isn't this very American-centric? Because, like, what if it was we who became Canadians?
Well, I mean, Canada can't invade the United States, so that's not a viable route.
Why can they not?
The Canadian army is much too small to invade and conquer the United States of America.
What if they tempted us with high-quality maple syrup?
Not even then.
Okay.
Not even if they fired the missile under the CN Tower.
What if they spied on us with weather balloons that moved slowly enough that we didn't even suspect them?
I think even then they would struggle, Neuro.
Okay.
Yeah, that handicap in manpower is really going to hurt them.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's like 1/10 the population of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's going to be a struggle in the best of circumstances.
Chad is asking why you called the president of El Salvador a dictator. Wasn't he democratically elected?
I mean, Kim Jong-un was democratically elected by that definition.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think anybody's going to accuse him of being anything other than a dictator. That's not to say that El Salvador is as bad as North Korea. That's not true. But yeah, I mean, keep in mind Bukele, his name, the president of El Salvador right now, was not allowed to run for a second term. It was unconstitutional for him to do that. And when people questioned him about it, he said, "I'm just going to do it anyway." And he did. And he won. So his second term as president is totally illegal and unconstitutional, and he doesn't give a shit, and nobody can stop him because he controls the courts.
Oh, okay.
And his backers are in the legislature. So he He's not necessarily like a North Korea style dictator, but as far as Latin America goes, he's about as close to a dictator as you can get without going like full oppression. Yeah, I think the reason people hesitate to call him like a full-on dictator is that he's popular. People do not complain about the fact that he exerts a lot of authority that he does not have, because he has delivered results that are pretty popular in the country thus far. We'll see how long that lasts. There was a time when Ortega in Nicaragua did the same. I don't think there's a lot of people left in Nicaragua that would claim that he's a popular president. So he's definitely been moved into the dictator bracket. Bekele may be on the same track.
That makes sense. They aren't a dictator in title, but their scope of power and the way that they respect or disrespect the rules is more similar to a dictator than it is a fairly elected president.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I guess you could call him an illiberal Democrat. There's this notion of a liberal democracy where you have a democracy, but the powers that be bend the rules in their favor in a way that creates an uneven playing field such that it's not really a full democracy. And there's a whole range along which governments can fall in that regard. In Bukele's case, he's pretty far in the direction of authoritarian, given that he is like explicitly serving illegally and nobody can stop him because he controls the courts. So, that's definitely more authoritarian. More in the middle of the pack is something like Hungary, where you have Orban and his party, which are genuinely popular, but maintain control of the government, partly because they jury-rigged the electoral system in their favor about 10 years ago, and also have systematically pressured opposition media out of business to the point where all of the major media outlets now are pro-government. So Orban is not a dictator like Bukele is, but he has bent so many rules in so many ways at this point that you can't really say that his government is fully democratic either. So these are examples of illiberal democracy, what you might think of as unfair, soft authoritarian democracy. I've seen some people place the United States before the Civil Rights Act in that category. Obviously, if you were white, pre-Civil Act rights, United States was as free, maybe the most free country on the planet. But if you were black, different story.
Yeah.
If you were a black American before the Civil Rights Act, especially if you were living in the South, you could credibly argue that you were living in an authoritarian country. Does that mean that it was authoritarian in like a Soviet or Nazi sense? No. You can't argue that. But it wasn't really free either. It was not really democratic for you as a black American. So, illiberal democracy has a long history. It's not just like a recent thing that's emerged with the current generation of populist politics. It's always been around to one degree or another, certainly in the United States. But that makes it difficult to call people like, say, Bukele or especially Orban dictators. They're not dictators in a classical sense, where they just control everything themselves through violence. Rather, they control through misinformation, through domination and monopolization of key government institutions, by allying with people in the private sector who crowd out opposition media. These are sort of soft, non-violent alternatives that lead to the same result, which is unfair domination of a government.
Yeah, you can be more or less above water, doing the same things and having the same amount of power. It's kind of like, how performative are you in trying to make it look democratic?
Yeah, Vladimir Putin used to be in that sort of realm, but then after, as we've discussed before, after 2010, 2011, he pretty decisively moved into the authoritarian bracket. They didn't really bother pretending much after that. And there's some people in the United States and the West more broadly who find the liberal democratic model appealing, because they are a part of a sort of national conservative movement, if you want to call that a movement, that kind of like the progressive left, sees a lot of elites wielding disproportionate power over the culture and economy. But unlike the progressive left, They do not see that as a problem because it results in an uneven playing field for labor. They see it as more of a problem because it results in liberal challenges to traditional culture. And correspondingly, they think that the government should be more active, like the progressive left, but unlike the progressive left, they only want the government to be more active in terms of restraining corporate power where it is being allegedly misused by what they would call the woke left. You kind of saw that in Florida with the whole DeSantis Disney imbroglio. That's more their vision of a quote unquote strong government.
The woke left. What a concept.
Well, there's more legitimate grounds too. Things like anti-free trade. That's another pillar of the populist movement, and that's on stronger ground, since that's easily identifiable, and there is an argument to be made for less free trade and more support for native industry. That is at least a debate that economists and other public policy people would be familiar with. The woke stuff tends to get a little abstract.
Yeah.
And that's an understatement. And really, it's extremely abstract and hard to pin down.
Yeah. I was explaining that earlier to viewers and how it's describing raising awareness of social issues, but the issues themselves are so different from each other that a person who you might call woke isn't going to be on the same page as everyone else who might identify that way, because there's so many different groups that are being oppressed, that are fighting for their rights, et cetera, et cetera. So one can only go so far in casting a wide net of people who push for social change, because that can be in a lot of different directions. I was talking earlier about how I don't really identify as either a Republican or a Democrat, because someone asked me, are you a Republican or a Democrat? And I was like, well, I don't really self-describe myself as one, and I'm not a party member of either. And the times that I voted for a mixture of parties, mainly just based on quickly searching the candidate and seeing if they're involved in any scandals, because that's an easy way to rule out some of your votes.
There you go.
Like, oh, this guy's been money laundering and stuff. It's like, okay, well, even though he might be more of my political orientation, he's not of good character, so let's not vote for that. And I think the character of the candidate and their ability to articulate some kind of vision for the future themselves, I think is something that people who have more progressive values like myself are hungry for and haven't really had much of. Because I feel like because Biden is very much the safe bet candidate, he isn't really pushing for any major changes. He's kind of trying to keep all the kids in the class from yelling too much. That's more of his goal.
Yeah.
And then Trump lists off so many different idealistic, crazy changes that you wouldn't even be able to get all of them through in a presidency. So it's kind of like you're going to be disappointed either way. It's sort of like, which disappointment do you choose?
Yeah. But to finish the earlier point, there is kind of a rising tide of illiberal democracy in the West. And a lot of the national conservative crowd sees that as appealing. You can kind of see that manifesting as a CPAC inviting people like Viktor Orban and Bukele to come to speak. CPAC is not really representative of all conservatives in the United States, but it is pretty conservative of the national conservative movement in the United States. And the fact that they find figures like that appealing, besides being concerning, also just illustrates that they think that stronger government action in pursuit of what they consider to be their values is totally legitimate, and that if they have to bend the rules to make that happen, then that is a justifiable thing to do, because they paint the alternative as the destruction and implosion of traditional values in the United States, if not the broader Western world.
AKA, this person is fighting for what I care about.
Yeah.
And they speak in words that I understand. Chat
So we'll
asked
see if,
who won in the Disney versus Florida
oh,
thingy.
they both did.
Oh,
Yeah, Disney's authority was not really substantively challenged. I don't remember the specifics of the final agreement they made, but basically Disney walked away with most of its control over the tax area in question intact. And DeSantis, meanwhile, got to successfully pretend to strike a blow against the woke corporations of America, which, of course, very much appealed to his voting base. So a political victory for DeSantis and a tax victory for Disney. The best of both worlds for all parties involved.
it was a successful prize fight where they both raised funds. That's funny.
Better analogy would be WWE.
Okay.
You know, it's a fight, but it's a fight with quotation marks around fight. It's more performative than anything. It's more for It was done more for entertainment value than it was to affect any kind of actual substantive change vis-a-vis Disney's corporate governance over the special tax area in and around Disney World. So, you know, in so much as that was the case, then very successful effort. You know, DeSantis got to look tough, and Disney, meanwhile, had to give up virtually nothing. Unfortunately, theater is a big part of politics, and always has been. But it feels like there's been more theater in American politics over the past 10 years because there's been so much populism and disestablishmentarianism. It's very exciting for the casual voter. I find it boring because I know it's not going to go anywhere. If I'm looking at public policy, I want to know, what's this going to change? How is it designed? You know, that kind of stuff. But theater like that doesn't really involve any of that. It doesn't really require creativity. It doesn't require interesting solutions to problems. It doesn't address the problem of trade-offs. It's just a way of generating votes without actually doing anything.
Yeah. It's who can rile up the crowd for more attention.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
As a quick aside, I know most people listening are American, but we do have a few non-Americans listening. And so for their benefit, I would point out, as I have before, that American political parties are very, very different from European political parties. European political parties are much, much more centralized and much, much better organized. American political parties are basically just a label, and that's about it. They have very little organizational depth to them. You know, if you want to run for office as a member of a party in Europe, they have a whole vetting process, and they're going to pick and choose based off of not only who's the best candidate, but also things like seniority and whatnot. In American political parties, anything goes. There was an election in a district of Chicago, maybe 15 some years ago, and clearly a Democratic district. Like, everybody knew it was going to vote Democrat. And the result was that nobody in this one particular year decided to run as the Republican candidate. And noting that there was no Republican candidate, a local neo-Nazi decided to do it on their behalf.
What?
Yeah. He was a neo-Nazi, and he decided, since there was no competition, to just run as a Republican for the district. And that was totally legal. There are very few rules about running as a member of a party in the United States. So it's just it really is mostly based off of individual initiative and individual connections. You know, in general, being more connected with party establishment types makes it more likely that you'll be supported with money and whatnot, and that gives you a big advantage. But, you know, the lower the level of the office, especially when you get down to like the local level, the more likely it is just regular people running for office with few, if any, ties to the actual national or even state political party in question. So it's way more of a decentralized process here in the United States. And the respective parties really do not have much in the way of, like, things like a youth wing, for example. Parties in Europe generally have like a youth division responsible for mobilizing young people and getting them interested, and they'll have like camps and things like that. The parties in the United States don't do nearly as much of that. Generally, reaching out to the youth is done more by volunteers or by NGOs. Well, NGOs other than the political party in question. So it's just a very different way. And I guess just to bring it full circle, parties are just very different. So it's important to keep that in mind when you're talking about American politics, because I think sometimes people in Europe, and sometimes even people in the United States, tend to talk about political parties in the United States as though they were comparable to parties in Europe, and they're really, really not. They're in a whole different league. We doing okay?
Yeah, I got about 7 minutes left if you want to rap or share a funny story or so on.
A funny story. I don't know if I have any funny stories. I did buy another book.
What'd you get?
Yeah. Was it The Search for Modern? Yeah, The Search for Modern China. Got another China book to put on my stack. I guess it wasn't tall enough for me. But yeah, it's. I read it was recommended on a podcast I was listening to a couple years ago. Actually, it's been on my to-read list. It's been on my to-read list for a while. So I finally pulled the trigger on it the other day. So I'm looking forward to getting into that. In addition to all the other stuff I'm reading. I'm still reading The Iron Wall, that book about Israeli foreign policy. I wasn't aware that Golda Meir was as stubborn as she apparently was. That kind of surprised me. I guess I shouldn't have been.
Golda Meir?
Golda Meir was Prime Minister of Israel back in the 1970s. I want to say late 60s, early 70s. And I'd always had a pretty positive impression of her because I guess for one, she was a female prime minister, which was very unusual for the region, obviously. But even within Israel, I think she's the only female prime minister they've ever had, and obviously the first. So, I kind of assumed when I was younger that she must have been, I don't know, I guess I just assumed she must have been like a pretty effective leader. I'd only ever really heard pretty good things about her. But in retrospect, I didn't hear that much about her, and I never really knew that much about her administration. So I finally read more in detail about it in this book, and wow, her leadership style left a lot to be desired. Very stubborn, refused to listen to advice, very strong-willed, very set in her ways. Just a very inflexible leader, it seems. So I totally surprised me. I was not aware of that. She was pretty demure when it came to the Israeli military. She apparently just kind of deferred to their authority on security matters because she was not very confident in her own understanding of them. And that resulted in the military having disproportionate voice in security matters, which was something of a problem because it basically just marginalized the political side of security matters. And, results kind of speak for themselves. A lot of that was part of the genesis of the current intractability of the conflict between Palestine and Israel. Yeah, the author is making the case that there were two marginal factions within Israeli politics that wanted different things. I'm speaking here with regard to the West Bank and Gaza, territories that were seized after the Six-Day War in 1967. Well, seized during the Six-Day War in 1967. And there was a lot of debate within the Israeli government about what to do with those territories. And one marginal group wanted to trade them away. They did not want to hang on to them. They did not want to be really stubborn about it, though. They wanted to basically just give the territories back to Jordan in exchange for relatively mild concessions. Um, that would have been pretty useful because it would have meant that Israel did not have to wield authority over, a whole shit ton of Palestinians in the West Bank that did not want to be under their authority. So that would have solved a lot of the current problems in the conflict. The other marginal group was very expansionist, and they actually wanted to just outright annex the territory in question, which probably would have laid the groundwork for problems later, but it also would have extended nominally civil rights and full equal citizenship rights to the Arabs in the West Bank. So that would have also solved a lot of the problems that we have now. So, as was the majority opinion, and certainly the opinion of Golda Meir, who ended up imposing her own vision, was that Israel should hang on to the territories, not annex them, but rather use them as leverage to get a comprehensive peace deal with all Arab states in the region, which was a very high bar, I have to say. I can't blame her for wanting a comprehensive peace with all Arab states in the region. Like, for sure, that's a totally legitimate objective. But the idea that she was going to be able to leverage the West Bank into that does not seem realistic at all to me. So I'm still reading the book, I'm still learning, but man, having read that chapter, it really explains a lot about how the conflict vis-a-vis the Palestinians got to where it is today. Because if they had not if they were going to hang on to the territory, annexing it and extending citizenship rights would have been better. If they didn't want to do that, it would have been better to just hand the territory back. Actually, the original plan to hand the West Bank back to Jordan was pretty reasonable, because they were not going to hand back the entire territory. They were actually going to annex parts that had strategic value, but all of the parts that were the most densely populated by Palestinians, those parts would not be annexed and would be handed over to Jordan. So that's a pretty reasonable trade-off to me. I mean, it seems reasonable to me anyway. And if they had gone that route, I think the conflict would be much less intractable at this point and would be way less violent and more manageable. But unfortunately, Golda Meir was not having that, it seems. And the military's influence was no small part of that. And very interesting to see the earliest genesis of the present conflict there.
Chat saying I thought Jordan didn't want them. Yeah, that's probably why the deal didn't work out.
It's not that Jordan didn't want them. It's that they didn't want to meet the conditions that the Israeli government laid out. A comprehensive peace was pretty controversial in the 1970s. And so that was not really a realistic ask of the Jordanian government at the time. Granted, they did not have a representative government. The king of Jordan had an absolute monarchy. So if he'd wanted to impose one, he could have. But doing so would have incurred the wrath of certainly the Palestinians living in Jordan, who made up a good chunk of the population, if not also the native Jordanian Arabs in the country. And as we saw with Black September, it was not outside the realm of possibility that there could be a revolt that overthrew the monarchy. So you can't really blame the king of Jordan for being hesitant to engage in what would have been a very unpopular peace deal with Jordan. And I think I also read that part of the Jordanian position is that, what was it exactly? There was some particular thing that they were hung up on that they didn't like about the Israeli peace offer that led to them stonewalling until the 1990s, when the peace deal between Jordan and Israel was finally signed. I don't remember exactly, but basically that was what led the Jordanian government to be intransigent on the West Bank peace offer from Israel. It's not that they didn't want the territory back, they just weren't willing to give as much away as the Israelis wanted. And so there were basically no progress in the talks over the West Bank and Gaza for like 20 years. And then when there was eventually a comprehensive peace deal between Israel and Jordan specifically, Jordan in the end was willing to concede the territory rather than take it back. I'll have to go back and read that again because I'm suddenly having trouble remembering what it was that tripped them up. But getting the territory back was not, they did not explicitly reject the return of the territory. They did want it back for sure.
Yeah, it was more the conditions of the deal were not good for them.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Well, cool. Just for fun dipping into movie and content conversation before we wrap up, I started watching two of my favorite anime with my girlfriend last Wednesday. Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. We watched the first episode of that, and then Tengen Toppa Gurren Lagann. We watched the first episode of that.
Cool.
Yeah, those are my top two favorites. Third was Samurai Champloo. I like the music and the vibe of that one. Cool fighting style and animation and characters of that. But Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood just has the perfect amount of build-up, really good characters, really interesting side characters, character arcs, cool like magic and fighting system, lots of cool reveals throughout the story. It's really, really good. Full Metal Alchemist. So we're watching through that, and then X-Men 97 is kind of like a return to form of the original X-Men animated series, and the story of that one has been crazy.
Crazy good or just crazy?
I would say crazy good. I didn't watch all of the original X-Men series. That was more Trisha's thing. So she knows like all of what happened in that one. Whereas for me, I've seen the movies, like the modern movies of X-Men, but I don't know all of that story. But the animation is really cool. The characters are cool. They're definitely more powerful in the TV show, I think, than in the movies for the different things that some of the characters can do.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, CGI limitations were kind of an issue for the movies.
Mm.
Yeah, so in the cartoon, they were able to be a little more comic book accurate.
Yeah.
Would you recommend it? I was thinking about it, but I haven't watched it yet.
Yeah, it's very fast-paced in terms of lots of big things are happening very quick in every episode. So it's definitely not slow. It's interesting to see like who's going to live and who's going to die, because I think with all the timelines and stuff, it's hard to keep track of like who has actually died versus who is able to get around death in some way and come back and be a character. But definitely intense, definitely good. Chat's also saying they recommend Shogun. I would like to see that. That's on Disney Plus. Just some cool samurai shit. Sorry, what?
I've heard good things about that.
Mm-hmm. And then Fallout also coming out, but some people giving it some backlash saying that the butts were not big enough.
Well, I can't attest to that one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
Optimal ass size is very subjective.
He speaks the truth. That's true. Depends on who you ask. 90s TV show theme is a banger. Yeah, the original Batman animated was in that time period and also very good.
Have you ever seen the Japanese intro to the original X-Men animated series back in the 90s?
I don't think so.
Definitely try to check that out on YouTube. That's pretty fun. They went full anime with it. Totally different animation style even.
Mm-hmm.
Well, for what it's worth, I've been playing Total War again.
Ooh, cool.
In this case, it was Total War 3 Kingdoms. Had that on the to-play list for a pretty long time, so it was pretty cool to get into that finally.
Nice. So it's China then, Romance of Three Kingdoms.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
It's pretty good. They definitely made some changes as far as how the game is played. So I kind of have mixed feelings about that. It's still I'm still on my first playthrough, so I can't really make final judgment.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, they kind of take away some choice as far as how you play the game. Mm-hmm. Certainly in terms of units and where you place them. But that also kind of simplifies things and makes it a little easier to play, which is not a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, it's almost like a Total War arcade game in a way.
Mm-hmm.
It's still fun. I don't have a problem with it overall. But yeah, it is a little weird in that sense. But yeah, I would definitely give it high marks from what I've seen thus far.
I'm pretty stuck on Dota 2. It's a really deep and interesting game every time because the ideal play changes every time like the hero drafts change. So it really requires a lot of active thinking and decision making of when to attack and when to defend. And it also sources us with a lot of opportunity to talk about mindset and sportsmanship because of the state of the Dota community. It's definitely not falling short in entertainment. I got a little bit of BM today during Agent Smith from that Terran. I didn't say it out loud when it happened, but I sent an army of Broodlords at them, and they had already prepared a whole bunch of Vikings, which are just air-to-air ships that clear Broodlords pretty fast. And I made a mistake in attacking with the Broodlords and not having anti-air defense to deal with the Vikings. And as they killed all my broods, they just typed a couple question marks, like, what are you doing? Kind of rubbing it in a little bit. Not super BM, but it was like, wow, there is still a little bit in StarCraft, but it's nothing compared to stuff we hear from Dota. As a treat, I'll give you some direct quotes that I've written down from things that people have said. By the way, Chad, these are not things that I've said, and I don't endorse them. There's one, here we go. Nobody cares about you. It's an example. Team draft is moronic. Do us a favor and uninstall the game.
Classic.
Yep. If his mother would have aborted. Estas cacas, which means they are shit. Idiotas, which means idiots. Que chucha is what the fuck. Wind Ranger is garbage. You're trash fucking brain dead. And then recommendations for self-harm. I would rather lose than take this kind of win. Congrats on your trash win. The Centaur and the Mars are fucking awful. You're a rat trash. What a fucking idiot. He's so dumb. Basura de mierda, which means trash of shit. Farmeando todo en el Dota. You're just farming the whole game and not helping us. So this kind of thing. And people are saying these words, and they might be a little bit alarming because they wouldn't normally say this to someone face to face. So it's a different landscape of human behavior, and we're having fun and figuring out what's going on with it. But be reminded that you can make a change by being a person who focuses on the map objectives, thinks about the strategy, and lifts up other people. You improve all of us as a community, so keep trying your best. And if you're working on your tilt management, make sure you get up and take breaks between games. I think a lot of people, they take the energy and the fury of their lives in the world, and then they wait for the next person to make a misclick in a video game, and they just unload all of their negativity and venom over the past 3 to 5 business days on that poor, unsuspecting gamer. So be kind.
Civility is a bedrock of civilization.
Yeah. It also...
By which I infer that there is no civilization on the internet.
Not yet, but there's hope. Well, I appreciate you. Thank you for coming on, as always. I give you your normal challenge of a walk and some push-ups, and I figure it's probably getting a little bit warmer there, so be careful.
Yeah, it's going to, for sure, but it's actually been really rainy the past week or two, so that's kind of kept temperatures in check. So, yeah, I didn't have any problems today when I did it.
Good.
Pretty manageable.
Proud of you, Simon. I was working on my look and stuff, hitting the gym pretty often, and I applied for a casting here in LA for some kind of beauty product. I'm not sure what it was, but they needed a cast for buff shirtless men, and I applied and I made the second round of auditions. Whether I got it or not, I don't know yet, but at least I made the second round for the first time. That was pretty fun.
Well, you'll have to keep me appraised of that.
Yeah. We did participate in one music video, which is going to be released at some time in the near or distant future. I have no information on it. But
that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I was there for a few hours, got like hair and makeup and stuff done, had a slightly different outfit, that kind of thing. But that was cool as well. It's interesting to see how much stress is going on in that environment and how everyone is really pressed for time when it comes to making a production happen, because you have the time slot for the studio where you're doing it, and then you have to pay people who are involved in the process. You've got a lot of costuming. People are going to be showing up late. Some people are going to be on drugs. Who knows? So it's a a very interesting and lively place. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, cool. I'm glad you're doing well.
Yeah. And remember, I want to stay true to my principles. So if you feel like I'm falling by the wayside and I'm being corrupted by the bright lights of LA, you have full authority to slap the shit out of me and say, Neuro, that's not the way. So
I don't know that I'm the best person to be enforcing norms like that. But
Sure.
Sure. I'll do my best for you.
I'll give you my best slap attempt. Well, I appreciate you, Aidan Smith. And Fuzzy Cord, thank you for handling questions. And chat, thanks for weighing in. As always, if we messed up on anything, please leave us a scathing review in the comments. And we will see you on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG. Nice.